Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into a different kind of history. Not the polished version you learned in school, but the shadowed corridors of Victorian life, where respectable women sipped a drug more powerful than heroin from crystal vials in their parlors, where mothers dosed their crying babies with the same substance that would eventually kill them, where addiction was called medicine, and the slow unraveling of minds was considered proper treatment for being female. If these unsettling tales from the past help you drift into sleep, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly bring you that strange comfort. And if you'd like to help our channel grow, your support means more than you can imagine. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is where you are, and whether you've ever heard of this Victorian poison before. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same dark chapters of history. So settle in, dim your lights. Let the gaslight flicker in your mind's eye as we descend into a world where the cure was worse than any disease, where respectability and addiction walked hand in hand down fog-shrouded streets, and where women paid the highest price for simply existing in their own bodies. This is the story of laudanum, and it's more disturbing than you might imagine. Picture yourself in 1853, walking down a London street on a gray afternoon. The air tastes of coal smoke and dampness, that peculiar Victorian atmosphere where progress and poison mingled in every breath. Horse-drawn carriages clatter past on cobblestones slick with rain and worse. Women in their heavy crinolines navigate puddles of questionable origin while holding their skirts just high enough to avoid the filth, but not so high as to expose an ankle and invite scandal. Men in tall hats and dark coats hurry past, their faces grim with the weight of respectability and the day's business. You pass a grocer's shop, its windows grimy with the accumulation of coal smoke that settles on everything in the city. Inside, the displays are modest but varied. Jars of sweets promising brief pleasure to children whose lives hold little enough of it. Bottles of milk that might or might not still be fresh. Wheels of cheese, loaves of bread, bins of dried goods. And there, right next to the peppermints and behind the bread, sits a brown bottle with a faded label. Laudanum. Perhaps several bottles, actually, in different sizes for different budgets. Available for purchase by anyone with a few pennies. No questions asked. No prescription needed. No warning given. The shopkeeper would hand it over with the same casual efficiency as he'd sell you sugar or soap. Perhaps he'd chat about the weather while wrapping it. Perhaps he'd mention that his wife swears by it for her nerves. Perhaps he'd recommend the brand, having heard good things from other customers. The bottle itself is unremarkable. Brown glass, common to many medicinal preparations of the era, designed to protect the contents from light. The label might be elaborately designed or crudely printed, depending on the manufacturer's budget. It might boast of the medicine's purity, its effectiveness, its long history of use. It almost certainly wouldn't mention addiction, dependency, or the fact that thousands of people had already died from the very product you now hold in your hands. You might buy it for a headache, the kind that throbs behind your eyes and makes even dim gaslight feel like daggers. For a troublesome cough that's been keeping you awake at night and making your chest ache with every breath, worrying you that consumption might be taking hold. For monthly cramps that bend you double and leave you unable to do anything but curl up in bed. Though of course you can't actually stay in bed because there's work to be done, meals to prepare, children to mind, a household to manage. For the melancholy that's been hanging over you like London's perpetual fog, that gray weight that makes getting out of bed feel impossible and going through the motions of daily life feel like moving through thick mud. For the exhaustion of caring for 6 children in a house with no running water, where every task from washing to cooking to cleaning requires physical labor that leaves your back screaming and your hands raw. For the grief that came when 3 of those children died before their 5th birthdays, scarlet fever taking one, whooping cough another, the third to some fever that came on suddenly and carried her away in 3 days of agony you could do nothing to ease. For the sleepless nights that stretch on until dawn, your mind cycling through worries about money, about your husband's temper, about the children's health, about the roof that leaks and the coal that's running low, and the rent that's due, and the 100 other concerns that press down on you in the darkness. For the aching back that's been your constant companion since your last pregnancy, a dull throb that sharpens to lightning when you bend or lift or simply stand too long. For being a woman in a world designed to break women, where every aspect of your existence seems calculated to wear you down, where you have no voice in governance, no right to your own property or earnings, no say in even the most basic aspects of your own life, where you're expected to be endlessly patient and cheerful while the structures of society ensure you have every reason to be furious. The shopkeeper would hand you the bottle without ceremony. Perhaps he'd mention that his wife takes it daily. Perhaps he'd suggest mixing it with wine to improve the taste. Perhaps he'd recommend it for your infant who won't stop crying. After all, everyone takes laudanum. It's as common as tea, as accepted as Sunday services, as woven into Victorian life as corsets and calling cards. What the shopkeeper wouldn't tell you, because no one truly understood it yet, was that you'd just purchased your own destruction, that the brown liquid sloshing in that innocent-looking bottle contained enough opium to rival anything smoked in the notorious dens of the East End, that it was laced with alcohol strong enough to intoxicate on its own, that within weeks or months you'd need it not for pain but for survival, that your personality would fragment, your mind would fog, your moods would swing from euphoria to despair with dizzying speed, that you'd become one of the estimated hundreds of thousands of Victorian women quietly, respectably going mad in their own homes. They called it medicine. History should call it what it was: mass poisoning of an entire generation. The Victorian era gleams in our collective memory like polished silver, all manners and morals, progress and propriety. We picture ladies in silk gowns, gentlemen in top hats, gas-lit streets, and the relentless march of industry. We think of Dickens and Darwin, of empire and innovation. We imagine a world of strict social codes and even stricter self-control. But beneath the veneer of respectability ran a river of addiction so vast, so normalized, that contemporaries barely noticed they were drowning in it. The Victorians, for all their supposed moral superiority, were a society of addicts, and women bore the brunt of it. This wasn't the addiction of vice dens and criminals. This was addiction with a medical seal of approval, addiction prescribed by doctors, addiction purchased in pharmacies, general stores, and sweet shops, addiction that was so respectable, so ordinary, that admitting to taking it carried no more shame than admitting to drinking tea. The drug at the center of this epidemic was laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. To understand just how casually destructive this substance was, you need to know what it contained and what it did to the human body and mind when consumed regularly, as millions did. Laudanum was typically 10% opium by weight, though this varied wildly between manufacturers and even between different batches from the same source. That 10% sounds modest until you understand what it means in practice. Opium itself is a complex mixture of alkaloids extracted from the seed pods of Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. Among these alkaloids is morphine, the same powerful narcotic that modern medicine dispenses with extreme caution, prescribes for severe pain, monitors carefully for signs of dependence, and tries to limit to the shortest possible duration. Victorian laudanum users were consuming morphine in uncontrolled doses, sometimes multiple times daily, for years or decades. But morphine wasn't the only active ingredient. Opium also contains codeine, another potent pain reliever that's still used today, but under strict regulation. It contains thebaine, papaverine, noscapine, and dozens of other compounds, each with its own pharmacological effects. The Victorian laudanum user wasn't just taking one drug, but a cocktail of psychoactive substances, their combined effects unpredictable and their long-term consequences unknown. And all of this was suspended in alcohol, anywhere from 25% to 90% ethanol depending on the formulation, making laudanum as intoxicating as strong spirits. Some preparations contained more alcohol than opium by volume. Users were getting drunk and high simultaneously, though they might not recognize either state as such, simply feeling relief from their symptoms. In other words, every dose of laudanum delivered a double punch: the narcotic effects of opium and the intoxicating effects of alcohol. It was as if someone had combined heroin and vodka, created a drink that was simultaneously addictive on two completely different pharmacological levels, then sold it to housewives as a cure for headaches. The comparison to modern drugs is not hyperbole. Morphine, the primary active ingredient in laudanum, is metabolized in the body into compounds very similar to heroin. Laudanum users were, in effect, consuming what we would today call a hard drug, combined with significant alcohol, and doing so as casually as we might take aspirin. The alcohol content served multiple purposes, though none of them were mentioned in the cheerful advertisements. Obviously, it acted as a solvent, keeping the opium alkaloids in solution so they could be easily administered in drop form. But it also masked the intensely bitter taste of opium to some degree, though not enough to make laudanum pleasant, merely tolerable. More insidiously, the alcohol provided its own sedative and anxiolytic effects, contributing to the sense of relief users experienced. And perhaps most problematic, the alcohol increased the rate at which the opium alkaloids were absorbed into the bloodstream, intensifying and accelerating their effects. A typical adult dose was given as 10 to 30 drops, diluted in water or taken neat. But typical is misleading. Chronic users often took far more. 40 drops, 60 drops, 100 drops at a time became common among those who'd built up tolerance. Some users measured their doses not in drops, but in spoonfuls or small glassfuls. At these levels, the amount of morphine and alcohol being consumed daily rivaled or exceeded what we would consider dangerous by modern standards. And remember, there was no standardization. One manufacturer's laudanum might contain twice the morphine of another's. A fresh batch might be stronger than the dregs of an old bottle. The same dose that barely touched a person's symptoms one day might prove dangerously potent the next if they'd switched suppliers or the formulation had changed. Victorian laudanum users were playing pharmaceutical roulette every time they measured out their drops, never knowing exactly what dose they were truly taking. And unlike modern opioids, which are carefully dosed and monitored, laudanum's strength varied wildly. There was no standardized formulation. One apothecary's laudanum might be twice as strong as another's. The same bottle might vary in potency from top to bottom. Users had no way of knowing how much morphine they were actually consuming. They simply measured out drops, anywhere from 10 to 100, and hoped for the best. The taste was reportedly atrocious, bitter beyond description. To mask this bitterness, manufacturers added all manner of ingredients: honey, spices, wine, whiskey, brandy, even mercury and hashish in some formulations. These additives created a murky brew of unpredictable potency, a pharmacological roulette wheel spun several times a day by unsuspecting users. Some took it in water, some took it neat. Some mixed it with wine or gin, adding intoxication upon intoxication. The recommended dose for an adult ranged from 10 to 30 drops. But chronic users like the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning took 40 drops or more at a time, multiple times per day. At those doses, the cumulative effect was devastating. To put this in modern terms, imagine if pharmacies today sold bottles of liquid morphine mixed with grain alcohol, with no regulation on strength, no requirement for prescription, no warning labels, and no understanding of addiction. Imagine if doctors prescribed this mixture for everything from coughs to cancer, from anxiety to arthritis. Imagine if society considered it not only acceptable, but actually genteel to be dependent on such a substance. That was the Victorian reality, and it was everywhere. The story of how laudanum came to dominate Victorian medicine begins centuries earlier. In 1539, when a Swiss physician and alchemist named Paracelsus created an opium tincture he called laudanum, from the Latin word laudare, meaning to praise. He considered it a miracle cure, a universal remedy for human suffering. In his enthusiasm, he failed to notice, or perhaps chose to ignore, that his miracle cure created dependency stronger than almost any substance known to humanity. The formulation was refined over the centuries, and by the 1700s, a standardized version became widely available in Europe and North America. Laudanum's popularity exploded during the 19th century, particularly in Britain, where the opium trade with India and China made the raw material cheap and abundant. By the Victorian era, laudanum had become ubiquitous. It was sold not just in pharmacies, but in general stores, grocers, sweet shops, tobacconists, barber shops, and pubs. Street vendors hawked it alongside meat pies and flowers. It could be purchased by anyone of any age, at any time, for any reason or no reason at all. The price made it accessible to all classes. At a penny for 20 to 25 drops, laudanum was often cheaper than a bottle of gin or wine. It was cheaper than beer. For the working poor struggling in the industrial slums of Manchester or the docks of London, laudanum offered an affordable escape from grinding poverty and physical misery. But it was among the middle and upper classes that laudanum found its most enthusiastic adherents. For these women, confined by social convention to limited lives of domesticity, denied education, careers, or even basic autonomy, laudanum offered something precious: relief. Relief from the physical pain of repeated childbirths in an era before modern obstetrics. Relief from the exhaustion of managing large households with minimal help. Relief from the emotional suffocation of lives spent in drawing rooms, making calls, embroidering cushions, and playing piano. Most critically, laudanum offered relief from what Victorian doctors vaguely termed women's troubles. This catch-all phrase encompassed everything from menstrual cramps to menopause, from postpartum depression to general unhappiness with one's constrained existence. The Victorian medical establishment, entirely male and deeply suspicious of female biology, viewed women's bodies as fundamentally problematic, prone to mysterious ailments that required constant medical intervention. The medical theory of the time held that women were governed by their reproductive organs in ways that made them inherently unstable, weak, and prone to illness. The uterus itself was viewed almost as a separate entity, capable of wandering through the body, causing various symptoms, or of exerting some mysterious influence over woman's entire constitution. Menstruation was seen not as a normal biological process, but a monthly illness, a period of vulnerability during which women should rest and avoid exertion, intellectual work, or excitement. This pseudo-scientific framework meant that almost any complaint a woman might have could be attributed to her femaleness itself. Headaches must be related to her monthly cycle or her womb. Fatigue, obviously due to her delicate female constitution. Sadness or anxiety, her nerves, overly sensitive, as women's nerves were thought to be, overwhelmed by the strain of existence. Back pain, the weight of her womb pressing on other organs. Digestive troubles, nervous energy diverted to her reproductive system. Insomnia, an overactive imagination characteristic of the female temperament. The diagnosis was always some variation of hysteria, neurasthenia, the vapors, nervous exhaustion, or simply female troubles. The treatment was always the same: rest, restricted activity, and laudanum. Lots of laudanum. And their intervention of choice was laudanum, prescribed liberally, often for years or decades, with no concern for dependency, because dependency wasn't recognized as a medical problem. If a woman needed to take her medicine every day for the rest of her life, well, that simply proved how seriously ill she was, how much she needed medical care, how fortunate she was to have access to such helpful treatment. The extent to which Victorian medicine targeted women with opiates is genuinely shocking by modern standards. Walk through any Victorian pharmacy, and you'd find an entire section dedicated to patent medicines specifically marketed to women. Their shelves lined with bottles bearing names designed to reassure and attract female customers. Their names drip with paternalistic reassurance, suggesting that somewhere, some idealized maternal figure had created these remedies out of love and care. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Mrs. Bailey's quieting syrup, Godfrey's cordial, Mother's helper, Woman's friend. These weren't marginal products sold in back alleys. These were mainstream medicines, advertised in respectable newspapers and magazines, recommended by doctors, sold in pharmacies and general stores, used by millions of women across all social classes. The manufacturers understood their market well. Women, restricted from most forms of economic activity, still controlled household budgets and made purchasing decisions about family health. Marketing to women meant success, and the most effective marketing used other women's names and images, creating a false sense of sisterhood and trust. The advertisements themselves reveal volumes about Victorian attitudes toward women and their place in society. They positioned women as inherently weak, perpetually suffering, constantly in need of chemical intervention to function at even a basic level. One advertisement for a popular laudanum-based remedy claimed it would help women regain their natural bloom and vivacity, implying that without chemical assistance, women naturally withered and dulled. Another promised to cure all disorders peculiar to the gentler sex, suggesting that being female itself was a disorder requiring treatment. Some ads explicitly tied women's suffering to their social roles. A medicine might be marketed as essential for the overwrought mother, or the exhausted housekeeper, or the nervous bride. These ads acknowledged, in their own twisted way, that the lives Victorian society forced women to lead were difficult, exhausting, overwhelming. But rather than suggesting any change to those social conditions, they offered a chemical patch, a way to continue in impossible circumstances by numbing yourself to them. The medical journals of the time are filled with case studies and recommendations that are chilling to read now. Doctors routinely prescribed laudanum for menstrual cramps, sometimes recommending doses that would be considered dangerous today. They prescribed it for the emotional distress of new motherhood, apparently unconcerned that nursing mothers were passing opium to their infants through breast milk. They prescribed it for menopausal symptoms, for difficulties in pregnancy, for recovery after childbirth, often starting women on a course of treatment they would continue for the rest of their lives. Particularly insidious was the use of laudanum to treat what was called hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis applied to women who expressed strong emotions, particularly negative ones like anger or frustration, or who behaved in ways that didn't conform to Victorian ideals of feminine passivity and agreeability. A woman who complained about her circumstances, who expressed dissatisfaction with her limited life, who showed signs of depression or anxiety, might be diagnosed with hysteria and prescribed opium to calm her nerves and make her more tractable. This wasn't accidental. Victorian society had created impossible conditions for women, particularly middle and upper-class women, then offered them opium as compensation. Women were expected to be eternally patient, gentle, submissive, and selfless, paragons of domestic virtue who never complained, never objected, never expressed wants or needs of their own. They were to bear children regularly, knowing that many would die, and accepting these deaths with Christian fortitude and stoic grace. They were to manage complex households, supervising servants, organizing social events, maintaining intricate networks of social obligation, all while making it look effortless. They were forbidden from most forms of education, beyond basic literacy and ornamental accomplishments like music or drawing. Barred from professions, denied access to universities, discouraged from intellectual pursuits beyond light reading, unable to own property in their own names after marriage, with their assets and any income they generated becoming their husband's property, denied the vote, excluded from political life, having no voice in the laws that governed them, expected to have no sexual desires of their own, with sex something to be endured for procreation rather than enjoyed, punished socially for any deviation from rigid norms of femininity, with gossip and exclusion awaiting those who stepped out of line. The extent to which Victorian medicine targeted women with opiates is genuinely shocking by modern standards. Walk through any Victorian pharmacy, and you'd find an entire section dedicated to patent medicines specifically marketed to women. Their names drip with paternalistic reassurance. Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, Mrs. Bailey's Quieting Syrup, Godfrey's Cordial, Mother's Helper, Woman's Friend. These medicines, all containing opium in various forms, were advertised relentlessly in newspapers, magazines, and broadsides. The advertisements promised relief from every conceivable female complaint: menstrual cramps, irregular periods, painful childbirth, postpartum depression, menopausal symptoms, nervous exhaustion, hysteria, the vapors, fainting fits, insomnia, neuralgia, and a dozen other vague conditions that existed more in the minds of male doctors than in actual pathology. The language of these advertisements reveals much about Victorian attitudes toward women. They positioned women as inherently weak, perpetually suffering, constantly in need of chemical intervention to function. One advertisement for a popular laudanum-based remedy claimed it would help women regain their natural bloom and vivacity, while another promised to cure all disorders peculiar to the gentler sex. But behind the flowery language was a grimmer reality. Victorian society had created impossible conditions for women, particularly middle and upper-class women, then offered them opium as compensation. Women were expected to be eternally patient, gentle, submissive, and selfless. They were to bear children regularly, losing many to disease and accepting it with Christian fortitude. They were to manage complex households, supervise servants, entertain guests, maintain social connections, support their husbands' careers, and do it all while wearing corsets that compressed their organs and dresses that weighed upwards of 30 pounds. They were forbidden from most forms of education, barred from professions, unable to own property in their own names after marriage, denied the vote, expected to have no sexual desires, punished socially for any deviation from rigid norms of femininity. And when the strain of living under these conditions manifested in physical or emotional distress, they were told they suffered from women's troubles and handed a bottle of laudanum. The medical profession actively encouraged this. Doctors prescribed opiates liberally to female patients, often for complaints that were really symptoms of repression, frustration, or exhaustion. A woman who felt listless and sad might be diagnosed with neurasthenia and given laudanum. A woman who experienced anxiety might be told she suffered from hysteria and prescribed opium. A woman who expressed anger or frustration might be labeled as having female troubles and dosed accordingly. The irony is crushing. Women were trapped in a social system that made them miserable, then drugged into compliance with that same system. Laudanum didn't cure anything. It simply made women too foggy, too sedated, too detached to object to their circumstances. It turned potential rebels into docile shadows drifting through their own lives. And the doctors who prescribed it, the husbands who encouraged it, the society that normalized it, all failed to recognize, or chose not to recognize, that they were systematically addicting an entire gender. The statistics are damning. By the late 1800s, researchers estimated that 70 to 80% of opiate addicts in America were women. Not criminals, not members of the underclass. Respectable, middle-class women addicted to legally prescribed and legally purchased opium, often with their families' full knowledge and approval. In England, the numbers were similar. Women consumed opium in massive quantities, sometimes purchasing multiple bottles per week. The scale of consumption was staggering. In some working-class districts, particularly in the fenlands of eastern England, opium consumption reached truly epidemic levels, with entire communities dependent on the drug. But while working-class addiction was at least visible and occasionally prompted concern, middle and upper-class addiction remained politely invisible. These women took their laudanum in private, behind closed doors, maintaining the fiction that they were merely treating medical conditions. Their addiction was respectable, even commendable. They were simply being good Victorian women, following their doctor's orders, taking their medicine like dutiful patients. No one called it addiction. That word was reserved for the opium smokers of the East End, for Chinese immigrants and dissolute characters from penny dreadfuls. Respectable women had habits or dependencies or simply medical needs. The language itself protected the guilty conscience of a society that was quite literally drugging its women into submission. And the women themselves, many of them, had no idea what was happening to them. They thought they were treating legitimate medical conditions. They believed the advertisements and the doctors. They trusted that these women's friends were actually friendly. By the time they realized they couldn't stop taking laudanum without suffering terribly, it was far too late. When you first take laudanum, if you've never experienced opiates before, the sensation is extraordinary, almost mystical in its intensity. Within minutes, as the morphine enters your bloodstream and crosses the blood-brain barrier, binding to opiate receptors throughout your nervous system, something fundamental shifts in your experience of being alive. pain recedes like a tide going out, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone has flipped a switch. That throbbing headache that's plagued you for days, that felt like someone was driving nails through your skull with each pulse of blood, simply dissolves into nothing. The cramping in your abdomen that made you double over, that felt like your organs were being twisted by some cruel hand, gone. The aching in your joints from rheumatism, the kind that makes every movement a negotiation between need and agony, vanished as though it had never existed. But more than just pain relief, there's a feeling, an emotional and psychological shift that many users found even more seductive than the physical relief. Warmth spreads through your body like you've stepped into a hot bath after hours in the bitter cold. A sensation of being held, cradled, protected. A sense of well-being, of rightness, of everything being exactly as it should be, suffuses your entire consciousness. The worries that kept you awake at night, cycling through your mind in endless loops of anxiety and catastrophizing, suddenly seem distant, unimportant, manageable. They haven't disappeared, but they've lost their power to hurt you. The frustrations of your life, the disappointments that accumulate like dust in corners, the losses that normally press on your chest like physical weight, they're still there, but they no longer matter in the same way. It's as if someone has wrapped your consciousness in soft wool, insulating you from the sharp edges of reality. Some users described an almost mystical sense of connection, of understanding, of everything making sense in a way it never had before. The patterns underlying existence seemed suddenly visible. Problems that had seemed insolvable appeared to have obvious solutions. Creative thoughts flowed freely, unimpeded by the usual barriers of doubt and self-criticism. Colors seemed more vivid, more meaningful. Sounds became more distinct, carrying emotional resonances you'd never noticed. Music could move you to tears. Poetry could speak directly to your soul. The world took on a dreamlike quality, beautiful and removed, as if you were watching life through a veil that somehow made everything more perfect rather than less clear. This is what the artists and poets chased. This state of heightened perception and lowered inhibition. This is why Samuel Taylor Coleridge claimed he composed Kubla Khan in an opium reverie, the entire poem arriving complete in a dream, and needing only to be transcribed. This is why Thomas de Quincey wrote an entire book praising opium as superior to alcohol, claiming it enhanced rather than diminished the mind, expanded rather than contracted consciousness. This is why Elizabeth Barrett Browning told her future husband that laudanum helped her write, that without it she felt too weak and sad to create, but with it the words flowed and her imagination soared. But they weren't just talking about pain relief, though that's what they nominally took the drug for. They were describing euphoria, the profound sense of pleasure and well-being that comes when opiates bind to receptors in the brain and trigger the release of dopamine and endorphins, the body's natural pleasure chemicals, but in amounts far beyond what any natural stimulus could produce. They were experiencing artificial happiness, chemical contentment that had nothing to do with their actual circumstances and everything to do with temporarily hijacked brain chemistry. They were high, though they wouldn't have used that word, and that high felt like the solution to everything. And like all hijackings, it couldn't last. The brain is remarkably adaptable, but adaptation isn't always beneficial. When flooded repeatedly with artificial opiates, the brain responds by downregulating its own production of natural endorphins and reducing the sensitivity of opiate receptors. What this means in practice is that your baseline mood shifts downward. Your natural capacity for pleasure and contentment erodes. Activities that once brought joy, simple pleasures like good food or pleasant company or beautiful weather, lose their ability to affect you. The color drains out of life, leaving everything gray and flat. After the euphoria comes dysphoria, the dark mirror image of that initial wonderful feeling. Laudanum, like all opiates, creates a chemical imbalance in the brain that the body tries to correct but can't while the drug continues to flood the system. It floods receptors with artificial stimulation, and the brain responds by reducing its own production of natural feel-good chemicals and becoming less sensitive to them. What goes up must come down, and the crash after an opiate high can be severe, sometimes more intense than the high itself. Users would swing from profound contentment to crushing depression in the space of hours, riding a chemical roller coaster they didn't understand and couldn't control. The world that seemed so beautiful and manageable while under the influence would suddenly appear gray, hostile, overwhelming when the drug wore off. Every problem that seemed solvable became insurmountable. Every disappointment felt catastrophic. The natural downs of life, the minor setbacks and frustrations that everyone experiences, became chasms of despair. And because users didn't understand what was happening, didn't connect their mood swings to the drug they were taking, they often interpreted these crashes as evidence of how sick they really were, how much they needed their medicine. This is the trap, elegant in its cruelty. The more laudanum you take, the worse you feel without it. Your baseline mood shifts downward. You need the drug not to feel good, but to feel normal. Not to achieve euphoria, but to avoid misery. What started as occasional pain relief becomes a daily necessity, becomes an hourly compulsion, becomes the organizing principle of your entire existence. And your body joins the conspiracy against you with ruthless efficiency. Tolerance builds rapidly with opiates, far more rapidly than most users or even most doctors of the era realized. The dose that once brought profound relief no longer touches your symptoms. The amount that made pain vanish now barely dulls it. The quantity that lifted your mood now just keeps you from sinking. You need more, and then more still. The escalation is insidious, creeping up by degrees until you're taking amounts that would have seemed impossible or terrifying when you first started. Users would start with the recommended 10 drops, a modest dose that seemed safe and reasonable, and within months be taking 50, 80, 100 drops at a time, swallowing what amounted to multiple medicinal doses in a single gulp. Elizabeth Barrett Browning admitted to 40 drops per dose, multiple times daily, a quantity that shocked even her opiate-using contemporaries. Others went higher still, measuring their doses in spoonfuls rather than drops, consuming quantities of morphine that would be considered dangerous by any standard, yet maintaining function well enough to hide the extent of their dependence from all but those closest to them. At these doses, the side effects become impossible to ignore. Constipation, sometimes severe enough to be dangerous, plagued chronic users. Respiratory depression meant some users struggled to breathe normally. Pinpoint pupils made their addiction visible to anyone who looked closely. Slurred speech marked them as intoxicated, even when they thought they were functioning normally. But the mental effects were worse. Long-term laudanum use created a characteristic state that observers described as being in a daze. Users appeared disconnected from reality, moving through their days in a fog of indifference. They seemed to neither know nor care what happened around them. Conversations would slide past them. Responsibilities would be forgotten. Time would lose meaning. They were there, physically present, but mentally absent, hollowed out. The person they'd been before the drug slowly eroded, replaced by a ghost who looked like them, but whose personality had been smoothed away by opium's relentless tide. Family members would notice changes. A woman who had been sharp and engaged would become vague and distant. A mother who had been attentive to her children would become neglectful, lost in her own interior haze. A wife who had managed a complex household would let things slide into disorder, unable to summon the focus or will to care. But remember, this was happening in an era when such things were politely ignored. Victorian propriety demanded that private troubles remain private. If a woman seemed abstracted, well, women were thought to be prone to melancholy. If she seemed indifferent to her surroundings, perhaps she was simply contemplative. If she dozed at inappropriate times, she must be fatigued from her many responsibilities. The addiction itself provided cover for its own symptoms. The mood swings could be dramatic. Elizabeth Siddal, the pre-Raphaelite muse and wife of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, was described by contemporaries as cycling between periods of relative normalcy and bouts of deep depression, increasing as her addiction progressed. Friends never knew which version of her they would encounter, the witty, artistic woman or the withdrawn, tearful one. This wasn't temperament. This was chemistry. When laudanum addicts went too long between doses, they experienced withdrawal. When they took their dose, they experienced relief, followed by intoxication, followed by the slide back toward withdrawal. Their moods tracked this chemical cycle, rising and falling with the tides of opium and alcohol in their bloodstreams. Some users experienced hallucinations, particularly if they took very high doses or if their particular formulation was especially strong. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the Romantic poet, was known to have suffered terrible laudanum-induced hallucinations. The line between intoxication and delirium could be thin, especially given the variable strength of different laudanum preparations. Women might see things that weren't there, hear voices, become convinced of things that were false. In an era that already considered women's minds unreliable and prone to hysteria, these symptoms only confirmed existing prejudices, while the real cause, the drug itself, went unquestioned. And then there was the constant specter of overdose. Because laudanum's strength varied so dramatically, and because tolerance meant users were taking increasingly large doses, the risk of accidental overdose was ever present. A woman who'd built up tolerance to her regular preparation might purchase a new bottle from a different source, one that happened to be stronger, and take her usual dose without realizing she was now consuming a potentially fatal amount of morphine. The symptoms of overdose were frightening. Breathing would become shallow and slow. The skin would turn cold and clammy, sometimes taking on a bluish tint from lack of oxygen. Pupils would constrict to pinpoints. Consciousness would fade in and out. Eventually, if the dose was high enough, breathing would stop. Many deaths that were attributed to other causes or simply listed as sudden death in Victorian records were likely unrecognized laudanum overdoses. The sheer scale of consumption meant that fatal overdoses must have been common, but without modern forensics or understanding of drug toxicity, they often went unidentified. Even non-fatal overdoses were devastating. Women would be found unconscious, sometimes unresponsive for hours. Their families gathered around, not understanding what had happened. Some would recover fully. Others would suffer lasting damage to their organs from prolonged oxygen deprivation. Still others would wake confused and disoriented, their memories of the event fractured or absent. And the cruelest part? The next day or the next week, they would need to take laudanum again. Because by this point, they weren't choosing to take it. Their bodies demanded it. The physical dependency was absolute. If they tried to stop, they would face withdrawal symptoms as bad as the original conditions that led them to laudanum in the first place, only worse. Aches that felt like their bones were trying to break through their skin. Nausea and vomiting that lasted for days. Diarrhea so severe it left them weak and dehydrated. Shaking hands, racing heart. Inability to sleep despite crushing exhaustion. Anxiety that made them feel like they were dying. Depression that made them wish they would. And unlike modern medical detox, where these symptoms can be managed with other medications and careful monitoring, Victorian women suffered through them alone, or with only their equally ignorant families for support. Many simply couldn't endure it. They would reach for the laudanum bottle again, promising themselves they'd try to quit later, knowing in their hearts they probably never would. This was the reality of laudanum use for hundreds of thousands of Victorian women, not the romantic dream world of opium-inspired poetry, but the grinding, desperate cycle of addiction. Need and relief, relief and need, punctuated by moments of crisis, stretched across years or decades, until death provided the only escape. They called it medicine. History should call it slow-motion tragedy. Some women's stories survived, preserved because of their fame, or because their addictions ended in dramatic ways that captured public attention. These stories illuminate what was happening to countless anonymous women in drawing rooms and tenements across the Victorian world. Elizabeth Barrett Browning first took laudanum at age 15, reportedly after suffering a spinal injury. For the rest of her life, she remained dependent on the drug. In letters to her future husband, the poet Robert Browning, she was remarkably frank about her usage, admitting to taking 40 drops at a time, multiple times per day. She initially claimed the laudanum was for pain relief, to treat her chronic lung problems and weakness. But as their correspondence continued and they grew closer, a different truth emerged. She took laudanum not just for physical pain, but for the depression and insomnia that made her unable to write. The drug was, in her mind, essential to her creative work. Without it, she felt too weak, too sad, too foggy to compose poetry. Her husband worried about her dependency. He gently suggested she try to reduce her dose. She would agree, then find reasons why today wasn't the right day to start. The pain was too severe. She had too much work to do. She wasn't sleeping well without it. The familiar excuses of addiction, dressed in Victorian propriety. Elizabeth Barrett Browning never managed to quit. She died at age 55, her health destroyed by years of opiate use. Her poetry survives, beautiful and enduring. But we'll never know what else she might have created, what other life she might have lived, without the fog of laudanum softening the sharp edges of her brilliant mind. Elizabeth Siddall's story is darker still. The golden-haired beauty who modeled for the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, particularly for Dante Gabriel Rossetti, whom she later married, first took laudanum after being prescribed it for unnamed health problems. She quickly became dependent, her usage increasing steadily over the years. She was an artist and poet in her own right, not just a muse. But her work was overshadowed by her famous husband and by her deteriorating condition. Her brother-in-law, William Rossetti, hinted that some of her poems were written under the influence of laudanum, though whether this was creative enhancement or simply the only way she could function is unclear. Her life was marked by tragedy. She suffered from tuberculosis, or possibly another chronic illness. She lost a stillborn daughter in 1861, a loss that sent her spiraling into deeper depression and heavier laudanum use. She sought oblivion in the drug, taking it not just for physical pain, but to escape the emotional agony of grief and illness. On February 11, 1862, Dante Gabriel Rossetti returned home from dinner to find Elizabeth unconscious. An empty laudanum bottle lay nearby. Whether the overdose was accidental or intentional remains debated by historians. She was pregnant at the time, which made the tragedy doubly devastating. Doctors were called. They tried to revive her, pumping her stomach, attempting every remedy they knew. But the dose had been massive. She never regained consciousness. She died in the early morning hours, aged only 32, her potential unfulfilled, her life cut short by the drug that was supposed to help her. Her husband was so devastated that he buried a manuscript of unpublished poems with her, though he later had her coffin exhumed to retrieve them. The story became a Victorian sensation, whispered about in drawing rooms. The beautiful model, the laudanum, the uncertain line between accident and suicide. But how many other Elizabeth Siddals died quietly, unknown, unremembered, with no famous husband to make their deaths notable? Mary Todd Lincoln, wife of the American President Abraham Lincoln, was another famous laudanum addict. She began taking it, like so many women, for legitimate medical complaints, specifically the debilitating headaches she suffered throughout her life. But the drug that eased her headaches also provided escape from the crushing pressures of being First Lady during the Civil War. Her addiction worsened after her husband's assassination. The trauma of witnessing his murder, combined with her pre-existing mental health struggles and her growing dependence on laudanum, left her increasingly unstable. She spent money recklessly, behaved erratically in public, and spoke of conspiracies. Her son eventually had her committed to a psychiatric institution, though she was released after a few months. How much of her behavior was mental illness, how much was grief, and how much was the effect of chronic laudanum intoxication combined with withdrawal when she couldn't access her supply? No one can say for certain now. The symptoms of long-term opiate abuse, particularly the paranoia, mood swings, and disconnection from reality, overlap disturbingly with what was described as Mary Lincoln's madness. Ada Lovelace, daughter of the poet Lord Byron and a mathematical genius in her own right, is sometimes credited as the world's first computer programmer for her work on Charles Babbage's analytical engine. She was prescribed laudanum for asthma and, like so many others, became addicted. The disease that killed her at age 36, uterine cancer, was agonizing. In her final months, she was given massive doses of laudanum to manage her pain. Some of her final letters, written while heavily medicated, show the characteristic signs of opiate intoxication: grandiose plans, disconnection from the severity of her condition, and that peculiar fog that settles over the mind when morphine dulls everything. She died young, in terrible pain, her extraordinary mind clouded by drugs. We can only wonder what more she might have achieved with a longer life and a clearer head. Even Samuel Taylor Coleridge's daughter, Sarah, confided to a friend that she couldn't sleep without laudanum. Born into a household where her father's addiction was well known and destructive, she nonetheless fell into the same trap, prescribed the same poison, caught in the same cycle. These women, famous enough for history to record their names, represent thousands upon thousands of others. Women whose names appear only in death certificates and pharmacy ledgers, women who lived and died in the grip of laudanum without anyone thinking to question whether this was normal, right, or healthy. Some survived their addictions, though survival often meant lifelong struggle. Others died directly from overdoses. Still others died prematurely from the cumulative damage of years of opiate use. Liver damage, respiratory problems, accidents caused by intoxication, infections from constipation, or simply giving up when the weight of addiction became too much to bear. Their stories, famous or anonymous, share common threads. They were offered a drug as a solution to problems, both medical and social. They trusted that solution. By the time they realized the solution was worse than the problem, they were trapped. And society, the same society that had pushed laudanum on them, offered them no real help in escaping it. If the scale of adult addiction to laudanum was shocking, the routine dosing of infants and children with the drug was genuinely horrifying, a practice so widespread and normalized that it barely registered as remarkable to most contemporaries. Victorian parents, particularly working-class parents, but by no means exclusively them, regularly gave their children opiate preparations, sometimes from birth, sometimes multiple times daily, with consequences that ranged from developmental delays to death. The reasoning seemed practical at the time, governed by the brutal logic of poverty and limited options. A crying baby kept parents awake, and when those parents had to rise before dawn to work 12 or 14-hour days in factories or fields, sleep wasn't a luxury but a necessity for survival. A restless toddler required constant supervision, and when a mother had 4 or 5 other children to care for, plus all the labor of running a household without modern conveniences, a child who would sit quietly for hours became not just convenient, but essential. Children teething experienced pain that made them irritable and difficult. And when no effective pain relief existed for children except opiates, what choice did parents have? And for working-class mothers who had to leave their children while they labored in factories, mines, or domestic service, often for 12 hours or more, there seemed no other option but to dose them into quiet compliance. The alternative, leaving an infant or toddler awake and alert, meant they might cry until they damaged themselves, might get into dangerous situations, might disturb neighbors who would complain to landlords, might require childcare that simply didn't exist or was too expensive to afford. Better, the logic went, to give them a few drops of something that would make them sleep peacefully through the long hours of parental absence. Patent medicines marketed specifically for children proliferated like weeds in a garden, their manufacturers understanding that there was enormous profit in convincing parents that their products were not just useful but necessary for proper child care. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was perhaps the most famous, achieving near universal name recognition and being sold across America, Britain, and the colonies for decades. But dozens of others competed for parents' money, each claiming to be the most effective, the safest, the most recommended. Mother's Helper, Infant's Friend, Baby's Quieting Syrup, Godfrey's Cordial, Atkinson and Barker's Royal Infant's Preservative. All contained opium in various forms and concentrations. All were marketed as safe and effective for even very young infants, sometimes claiming their products could be given from birth. All made expansive promises about the conditions they could treat and the relief they would provide. And none, at least not until the later reforms of the 19th century, warned parents about addiction, overdose, or the possibility that what they were giving their children might kill them. The advertisements were insidious in their manipulation of parental love and fear. One ad claimed Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup had been acknowledged as the best medicine in the world, a grandiose claim backed by exactly nothing. It supposedly relieved teething, colic, whooping cough, and various other childhood ailments, making it appear to be a miracle cure for the myriad small crises of early childhood. The advertisement even claimed it was highly recommended and frequently prescribed by the faculty, meaning doctors, lending it medical authority, and that it was supplied to Her Majesty, implying that the Queen herself trusted this medicine for her own children. What better reassurance could Victorian parents want? If doctors recommended it, if the Queen herself used this medicine for royal children who had access to the best medical care in the world, surely it must be safe. Surely giving it to your own children was the responsible, caring thing to do. What kind of parent would deny their suffering child relief when relief was available for just a few pennies? The reality was less reassuring and far more sinister. These syrups contained enough opium to sedate children into hours of unnatural sleep, a sleep that looked like peaceful rest but was actually drugged stupor. Babies who were dosed would lie still and quiet, not from contentment or healthy tiredness, but from the narcotic effects of morphine shutting down their systems. Their tiny respiratory systems, far more vulnerable than adults and still developing, would slow dangerously under the opiate load. Their heart rates would drop. Their body temperatures would fall. Some never woke up, slipping from drugged sleep into death without ever crying out or showing obvious distress. Infant mortality was already shockingly high in Victorian Britain, with nearly 1 in 5 children dying before their 5th birthday, from various causes: infectious diseases like scarlet fever and whooping cough, poor nutrition, accidents, and the general precariousness of life in an era before antibiotics or real understanding of disease transmission. Against this background of routine infant death, how many of those deaths were actually unrecognized opiate overdoses? How many children who died in their sleep, recorded simply as dying peacefully in the night with no obvious cause, had been given soothing syrup that evening? How many deaths attributed to colic or teething or general infant frailty were really respiratory depression from morphine? The records don't tell us, but circumstantial evidence and later medical research suggests the number was substantial, possibly accounting for a significant percentage of the mysterious, sudden infant deaths that were so common as to be almost expected. Working-class mothers faced impossible choices that no parent should ever face. They needed to work to feed their families, working conditions and wages being what they were. They had no access to childcare in any form we would recognize today. The concept of formal daycare barely existed. Extended family might help if they lived nearby and weren't themselves working, but industrialization had broken up family networks, sending people away from their home villages to cities and factory towns where they knew no one. Neighbors might be enlisted, but neighbors had their own children and their own survival to worry about. Leaving a baby alone while they labored for 12 or 14 hours risked the child crying until they hurt themselves, developing serious psychological damage from the abandonment and distress, or getting into dangerous situations in even the most carefully baby-proofed room. A crawling infant left alone for hours might find something dangerous to eat, might get tangled in bedding and suffocate, might soil themselves and lie in it for hours, developing serious rashes and infections, might simply scream themselves into illness from the terror and distress of being abandoned. But dosing the baby with laudanum ensured they would sleep through the day, quiet and still, apparently peaceful. When the mother returned home, exhausted from her own labor, she would find her child apparently rested and content, not knowing that the stillness was drugged stupor rather than healthy sleep. The fact that it also meant the baby wasn't eating properly during those long hours, wasn't developing normally because drugged sleep doesn't provide the same restoration as natural sleep, and was slowly becoming addicted to opiates, was either not recognized or considered an acceptable trade-off for survival in a system that gave them no better options. Poverty makes monsters of us all, not because it makes people evil, but because it forces impossible choices. The Victorian economic system that required mothers to work long hours away from their infants, that paid wages too low for a family to survive on one income, that provided no social support or childcare options, that treated working-class lives as expendable, bears ultimate responsibility for the drugging of an entire generation of children. The mothers who gave their babies laudanum weren't monsters. They were desperate people trying to survive in a system designed to grind them down. But even middle and upper-class parents who had no economic excuse, who could afford nannies and had no need to leave their children unattended for long hours, gave their children opiates. Partly this was ignorance, genuine belief that these medicines were safe because everyone used them, and the advertisements said they were safe, and even doctors recommended them. When a physician suggests giving your teething baby some soothing syrup, you trust that physician is acting in your child's best interest. Partly it was convenience, though admitting that sounds monstrous. A child dosed with laudanum before a dinner party or social event would sleep through it, causing no disruption or embarrassment. A fretful baby who wouldn't sleep at night would, with a few drops of opiate syrup, finally settle and let the household rest. A toddler prone to tantrums would become calm and tractable for hours. The temptation must have been enormous, and the consequences seemed minor or non-existent, at least until they became catastrophic. Nannies and nurses sometimes gave children opiates without parental knowledge or permission, simply to make their own work easier and their charges more manageable. The practice was so common that warnings against it appeared in household management books, though clearly not everyone heeded them. Mrs. Beeton's famous household management guide, the essential reference for running a Victorian middle-class household, cautioned against nurses who gave children cordials and sleeping draughts, noting that selfish and thoughtless nurses, and mothers too, sometimes give cordials and sleeping draughts, whose effects are too well known, but admitted the practice was widespread enough to require warning against. The long-term effects on children who survived this early exposure to opiates are impossible to measure now with any precision, but they must have been profound. Did regular opiate use in infancy affect brain development, leaving children with cognitive or emotional impairments that haunted them into adulthood? Did it affect their later health, damaging organs still in the process of forming? Did some grow into adults who struggled with addiction more easily because their brains had been altered by opiate exposure when they were most vulnerable? We'll never know for certain, but the modern understanding of how early drug exposure can permanently alter developing brains suggests the answer to all these questions is likely yes. What we do know is that the practice killed children. Coroners' inquests occasionally recorded verdicts of death from laudanum poisoning, though these were usually cases of obvious overdose where a parent or nurse had given far too much. The slow deaths, the children who simply failed to thrive while being regularly dosed with opiate syrups, likely went unrecognized. Public health officials began sounding alarms by the mid-19th century. Reports from working-class districts noted the widespread use of opiates to quiet children and connected it with poor health outcomes and mortality. Some reformers called for regulation of these patent medicines. Others argued for education campaigns to warn parents of the dangers. But the practice continued for decades. The drugs were too convenient, too profitable for manufacturers, too entrenched in childcare practices to be quickly eliminated. Even after the Pharmacy Act of 1868 restricted sales of pure opium, patent medicines containing opium remained widely available and unregulated for another 40 years. The final horror is this. Some children became so addicted that they experienced withdrawal when the opiates were stopped. Infants would cry inconsolably, not from colic or teething, but from withdrawal. And parents, not understanding what was happening, would give them more laudanum to stop the crying, perpetuating the cycle. This wasn't rare. This wasn't an aberration. This was normal childcare practice across Victorian society, from the working slums to the respectable suburbs. An entire generation of children was dosed with opiates, sometimes from birth, with effects that can only be imagined, but likely included thousands of deaths and countless cases of impaired development. The Victorians, for all their professed concern with morality and proper behavior, systematically drugged their own children, and barely anyone questioned it. While thousands of anonymous Victorian women spiraled into laudanum addiction in private, a significant number of writers, poets, and artists documented their experiences with the drug, sometimes deliberately, sometimes inadvertently. Their writings both romanticized opiate use and occasionally revealed its darker reality. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1821, stands as perhaps the most influential text on opiate use in the English language. De Quincey wrote with extraordinary honesty about his decades-long opium addiction, describing both the transcendent pleasures and the agonizing pains. He began taking opium, like so many others, for legitimate medical reasons, specifically to treat stomach pain. But he quickly discovered that opium did more than relieve pain. It transported the mind to regions of extraordinary beauty and insight. He described visions, dreams of stunning complexity and meaning, intellectual breakthroughs that seemed to come from some deep well of cosmic understanding. But he also described the pains of opium, the physical misery of addiction, the mental fog, the disruption of normal life, the desperate struggle to quit, and the repeated failures. His book was meant as both celebration and warning, though readers tended to focus more on the celebration than the warning. De Quincey inadvertently made opium seem glamorous, linking it with creativity, insight, and profound experience. Young artists and writers read his confessions and thought, "I want that." They failed to notice that De Quincey's life, despite his talents, was largely ruined by addiction. He lived in poverty, struggled to complete projects, and spent decades trying and failing to free himself from opium's grip. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, one of the greatest poets in English literature, battled laudanum addiction throughout his adult life. He began taking it for neuralgia and rheumatic pain, legitimate medical complaints. But what started as medicine became compulsion. His famous poem, Kubla Khan, was, by his own admission, composed during an opium reverie. He claimed the entire poem came to him complete in a dream induced by laudanum. And he was frantically trying to write it down when he was interrupted by a person on business from Porlock, causing him to forget the rest of the poem. This story became legendary. It seemed to prove that opium enhanced creativity, that it opened doors of perception unavailable to the sober mind. But it ignored the larger context. Coleridge's creativity actually declined as his addiction progressed. His later years were marked more by unfinished projects and failed attempts to write than by completed masterpieces. In private letters to friends, Coleridge was more honest about the reality of his addiction. He described the physical and mental anguish of withdrawal, the guilt and shame of being unable to quit, the way the drug had taken control of his life. These were the effects now recognized as classic addiction symptoms, But in his time, they were mysterious sufferings with no clear explanation or cure. In 1816, recognizing that he needed help, Coleridge placed himself under the care of a doctor and tried to quit. He didn't succeed in complete abstinence, but did manage to reduce his use to what he considered a controllable level. This pattern of struggle, partial success, and continued dependence marked the rest of his life. Wilkie Collins, author of some of Victorian literature's most celebrated novels, including The Woman in White and The Moonstone, used laudanum for years to treat gout and rheumatic pain. His addiction became so severe that friends and colleagues worried about him, noting his declining health and increasingly erratic behavior. The Moonstone, published in 1868, features laudanum as an essential plot element. The drug's effects on memory and behavior drive the mystery. Collins based his descriptions on personal experience, and readers at the time would have recognized the accuracy of his portrayal. Here was addiction appearing in respectable fiction, acknowledged but not condemned, simply presented as a fact of life. Anne Bronte, in her novel The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, created a character addicted to laudanum that was widely believed to be based on her brother Branwell, whose own laudanum addiction was destroying him and devastating his family. The Brontes knew addiction intimately. They watched it consume their brother, turn him from a promising young artist into a shambling wreck who could barely function. Yet, even with this tragedy playing out in their own home, the Brontes and their contemporaries didn't have the language or framework to understand addiction as a disease. It was seen as a moral failing, a weakness of character. This made the suffering even more isolating. Addicts couldn't seek help without admitting to shameful personal failure. Charles Dickens took laudanum for various ailments and wrote about it frequently in his novels and letters. In The Mystery of Edwin Drood, his final unfinished novel, he describes an opium den in great detail, painting a picture of squalor and degradation that fascinated and horrified his readers. But this focus on opium dens, on the exotic and criminal aspects of opiate use, had the effect of making respectable laudanum use seem different, safer, more acceptable by contrast. The opium smokers in the dens were degenerates. The laudanum users in drawing rooms were patients. The distinction was false, but it was comforting.
George Eliot, Mary Shelley, and Elizabeth Gaskell all wrote about laudanum in their works, treating it as an ordinary fact of Victorian life because it was. Their characters take it for headaches, give it to children, use it for suicide attempts. It appears as naturally as tea or carriages, unremarkable and universal. This normalization in literature both reflected and reinforced society's acceptance of the drug. When readers saw characters in novels taking laudanum for perfectly ordinary complaints, it confirmed that this was normal behavior, nothing to worry about, certainly nothing to be ashamed of. The poets who claimed laudanum enhanced their creativity were perhaps not entirely wrong. Opiates do affect perception and can produce vivid, sometimes profound experiences. But they ignored or minimized the cost of this enhancement. The addiction, the health problems, the abbreviated lives, the talent squandered in the fog of intoxication.
And for every famous writer who used laudanum and produced lasting work despite it, there were dozens or hundreds whose potential was destroyed before they could create anything of note. The ones who didn't become famous, didn't finish their novels, couldn't sustain the discipline needed for serious creative work because they were too busy managing their addiction. Literature romanticized laudanum, giving it an aura of artistic mystique. But literature also occasionally revealed its true nature, if readers looked closely enough. The tragic endings, the wasted lives, the characters who began taking opium for pain and ended destroyed by it, these were warnings hiding in plain sight. The Victorians read these stories but didn't heed them. They wanted to believe in laudanum's promise more than they wanted to acknowledge its danger. And so the epidemic continued, claimed new victims every day, while poets wrote beautiful verses about opium dreams, and everyone pretended not to notice the bodies. By the 1860s, some voices had begun to question whether the unrestricted sale of opiates was actually a good idea. Doctors were seeing too many cases of addiction, too many accidental overdoses, too many instances of infants being harmed. Reformers, particularly those involved in the temperance movement, began to notice that while society condemned alcohol as a vice, it accepted opium as medicine, despite opium causing similar or worse harm. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 was Britain's first serious attempt at drug regulation. It didn't ban laudanum or opium, but it did restrict their sale to qualified pharmacists and chemists. It also required that all opiate preparations be clearly labeled as poison, with distinctive bottles and warnings. This was a modest step, and enforcement was uneven, but it represented the first crack in society's acceptance of unrestricted opiate use. For the first time, the government acknowledged that these substances were dangerous and needed oversight. The act also began to change public perception. Once opiates were labeled as poison, people started to question whether they should be giving them to children or taking them for minor complaints. The mystique of the cure-all medicine began to fade, replaced by wariness and eventually fear. But change came slowly. Patent medicines remained largely unregulated. Manufacturers simply had to list opium in their ingredients, but they could still advertise their products as harmless, still market them to mothers and children, still make claims about miraculous cures. The law said the bottles had to be labeled. It didn't say the advertisements had to be honest. Throughout the 1870s and 80s, an anti-opium movement gradually gained strength. Religious organizations, medical reformers, and social activists began campaigning against both the domestic opium trade and Britain's role in forcing opium on China through the notorious Opium Wars. Benjamin Broomhall formed the Christian Union for the Severance of the British Empire with the Opium Traffic in 1888. This organization lobbied Parliament relentlessly, published pamphlets, gave speeches, and generally worked to make opium politically unacceptable. Their arguments combined moral outrage, public health concerns, and anti-imperialist sentiment. They pointed out the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed to be bringing civilization to the world, while simultaneously profiting from drug trafficking. They documented the human cost of addiction in Britain and abroad. They pressured politicians and influenced public opinion. By the end of the 19th century, attitudes had begun to shift significantly. The introduction of aspirin in the 1890s provided a safer alternative to laudanum for pain relief. Doctors increasingly prescribed aspirin instead of opiates for routine complaints, reserving laudanum for more severe pain. Medical journals began publishing articles about addiction, using that word explicitly rather than dancing around it with euphemisms. Doctors started to understand that dependence on opiates was a physical condition, not a moral failing. This understanding came far too late for hundreds of thousands of addicts, but it at least represented progress. The early 20th century brought more comprehensive regulation. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the United States required accurate labeling of drug content, including opiates, alcohol, cocaine, and other substances. Manufacturers could no longer hide what their patent medicines contained. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Sales of patent medicines containing opiates dropped by 33% after labeling became mandatory. Apparently, when people knew exactly what they were taking, many chose not to take it. Britain passed similar legislation in 1906, requiring disclosure of ingredients and limiting narcotic content. Canada followed in 1908. An international movement toward drug regulation was underway, and laudanum's days of unrestricted availability were ending. By 1910, Britain agreed to dismantle the India-China opium trade that had been such a profitable and shameful part of the empire. This was a major victory for the anti-opium movement and signaled that society's attitude toward opiates had fundamentally changed. The 1920s saw increasing restrictions. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Act and subsequent legislation essentially ended over-the-counter sales of opiates. Laudanum remained available, but only by prescription and only for specific medical uses. By mid-century, it had virtually disappeared from general medical practice, replaced by more precisely dosed opioids. But the change came far too late. By the time society recognized the danger of laudanum and took action to restrict it, millions of people had already been addicted. Millions more had died. Entire generations of children had been dosed with opiates. The scale of harm was incalculable. And the recognition came not from medical science discovering some new truth, but simply from society deciding to pay attention to what had been obvious all along. The information about addiction had existed. The warnings had been given. But it took decades of mounting evidence and changing social attitudes before anyone with power chose to act. The Victorian laudanum epidemic was allowed to continue for so long not because the dangers were unknown, but because acknowledging those dangers was inconvenient. Manufacturers made enormous profits. Doctors found it easier to prescribe a bottle than to address underlying causes. Husbands preferred docile, medicated wives to unhappy, demanding ones. Society chose addiction over the disruption that change would require. Eventually, the choice became untenable. The cost in human lives and suffering grew too large to ignore, and slowly, reluctantly, reform began. But every year of delay meant thousands more victims, thousands more families destroyed, thousands more children damaged before they could even begin to live. The story of laudanum's rise and fall is a story of social failure, of a culture that prioritized profit and convenience over human welfare, that experimented on its own population with a dangerous drug, and then took generations to admit the experiment had gone wrong. It's also a warning that we're still struggling to heed. Today, laudanum is a historical curiosity. It remains technically available by prescription under the name tincture of opium, used only for severe diarrhea that doesn't respond to other treatments, or occasionally for neonatal withdrawal syndrome, when a baby is born dependent on opiates due to the mother's use during pregnancy. These limited modern uses are tightly controlled, prescribed only when nothing else works, monitored carefully. The days of casual laudanum use are long gone, relegated to history books and Victorian novels. But the lessons of the laudanum epidemic remain urgently relevant, because we are, in many ways, repeating history. The modern opioid crisis shares disturbing parallels with the Victorian laudanum epidemic. Once again, pharmaceutical companies aggressively marketed powerful opiates, downplaying addiction risks. Once again, doctors prescribed these drugs liberally for conditions that might not have required them. Once again, patients became addicted while following legitimate prescriptions. Once again, society initially failed to recognize the scale of the problem. OxyContin and similar prescription opioids were marketed in the 1990s and early 2000s with claims that they were safe and had low addiction potential. Doctors prescribed them for everything, from major surgery to routine dental work. Patients took them as directed and found themselves unable to stop. By the time the medical establishment and regulatory agencies acknowledged the crisis, millions of people were already addicted. The pattern is eerily familiar. A powerful opiate, marketed as safe, prescribed freely, creating addiction on a massive scale. The details differ, but the fundamental dynamic is the same. Corporate profit and medical convenience prioritized over patient welfare, with predictable and tragic results. The gender dynamics differ slightly. The modern opioid crisis affects men and women more equally than laudanum affected primarily women. But women are still overprescribed pain medication and still face medical systems that sometimes don't take their pain seriously except to offer pills. And just as laudanum was used to medicate women out of questioning their social conditions, modern opioids are sometimes used to manage pain that has roots in social determinants of health: poverty, lack of access to care, work conditions, stress. Pills become a substitute for addressing structural problems. The Victorian laudanum epidemic also warns us about the dangers of self-medication and over-the-counter availability of powerful drugs. While we've learned that lesson for opiates, we're still grappling with it for other substances: anxiety medications, sleep aids, stimulants. The temptation to reach for a chemical solution to life's difficulties remains strong. We've also learned, or should have learned, that addiction is a medical condition, not a moral failing. The Victorians' moralizing about opium addiction prevented effective treatment and added shame to suffering. Modern addiction medicine recognizes physical dependence and works to treat it as a health issue. But stigma still exists, and it still prevents people from seeking help. The story of laudanum also reminds us to be skeptical of miracle cures and universal remedies. The Victorian patent medicines that claimed to cure everything from colic to consumption were frauds, dressed up in reassuring language and false testimonials. Modern equivalents exist in different forms: supplements marketed with health claims, wellness products that promise more than they deliver, alternative treatments touted as replacing conventional medicine. Critical thinking, skepticism, demand for evidence, these are the defenses against being sold our own poisoning. The Victorians lacked these defenses. We don't have that excuse. Perhaps most importantly, the laudanum epidemic shows the danger of normalizing harmful practices. Victorian society accepted laudanum use because everyone did it. It was normal, therefore it must be safe. This circular logic prevented recognition of harm for decades. We still do this. We normalize practices without questioning them. Overwork, chronic stress, inadequate sleep, diets heavy in processed foods, sedentary lifestyles. We treat these as inevitable features of modern life rather than as choices that harm us. The fact that everyone does something doesn't make it safe or wise. The Victorians eventually learned this lesson, though it took generations and cost countless lives. We have the advantage of their experience if we choose to learn from it. One final parallel deserves mention. The Victorian medical establishment, overwhelmingly male, prescribed laudanum freely to women for women's troubles that were often really symptoms of oppression and restricted lives. Modern medicine has improved, but women still report that their pain is taken less seriously than men's, that they're more likely to be prescribed psychiatric medications for physical complaints, that their symptoms are sometimes dismissed as emotional or hysterical. The specific drugs have changed, the underlying dynamic, a medical system that doesn't always listen to women or take their suffering seriously, that sometimes prefers to medicate rather than investigate, hasn't entirely gone away. The fight for better, more equitable health care continues. The story of laudanum is not just history. It's a mirror reflecting patterns we're still caught in, mistakes we're still making, lessons we're still struggling to learn. And so we return to where we began: a Victorian street, a shop window, a bottle of brown liquid that promised relief and delivered destruction. The women who reached for that bottle weren't weak or foolish. They were desperate, suffering, trapped in lives that gave them few options and even less power. They trusted their doctors, believed the advertisements, followed the prescriptions. They did everything right according to the standards of their time. And they were destroyed by it. Not all of them, not immediately, but in sufficient numbers and with sufficient devastation that we remember them still, ghosts in the historical record, warnings from the past. Some found ways to quit or reduce their use. Some lived with addiction for decades, managing it as best they could. Some died young, from overdoses or from the cumulative damage of years of opiate abuse. Some simply faded from history, their stories lost, their struggles forgotten. But they were real people, with hopes and fears, talents and limitations, joy and suffering. They lived in a world that gave them pain and then sold them poison disguised as cure. They deserved better than they got. We like to think we're more enlightened now. We have FDA regulation, prescription requirements, addiction medicine, public health campaigns. We know about addiction in ways the Victorians didn't. We have tools they lacked. But we're still making mistakes. The opioid crisis proves it. The continued medicalization of normal human experiences proves it. The way we still reach for chemical solutions to social problems proves it. The Victorian laudanum epidemic isn't just history to cluck our tongues at and congratulate ourselves for having moved past. It's a warning that we haven't heeded as well as we might like to think. It's a reminder that profits can motivate terrible harm, that medical authority can be wrong, that what seems normal can be deadly, that we are all capable of looking away from suffering if acknowledging it is inconvenient. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And the rhyme between Victorian laudanum and modern opioids is uncomfortably close. The women who suffered and died in the laudanum epidemic can't speak for themselves anymore. But their silence speaks volumes. It says, question authority. Demand evidence. Be skeptical of miracle cures. Listen to your body. Take care of each other. Don't trust that something is safe just because everyone does it. Most of all, it says, remember us. Remember what was done to us. Learn from our suffering so it doesn't happen again. So far, we haven't learned well enough. But maybe, just maybe, remembering their stories will help. The gaslights flicker and die. The Victorian street fades back into memory. But the lessons remain, written in sorrow and sealed with loss, waiting for us to finally truly understand them. If you found this journey through Victorian darkness compelling, if these forgotten stories resonated with you in some way, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explore history's shadowed corners, the stories that textbooks skip over, the truths that are uncomfortable but necessary to know. Share this video with someone who loves history, who needs to know this story, who might learn from these Victorian ghosts. Leave a comment telling me what shocked you most, what you think we still haven't learned, what parallels you see to our own time. Until next time, sleep well. And maybe, when you close your eyes, spare a thought for all those Victorian women lost to a drug that promised so much and took everything. Rest well, wherever you are now. In the past, we're still trying to understand. Your stories deserve to be told. And finally, after more than a century of silence, they are being heard. Good night. We still do this. We normalize practices without questioning them. Overwork, chronic stress, inadequate sleep, diets heavy in processed foods, sedentary lifestyles. We treat these as inevitable features of modern life rather than as choices that harm us. The fact that everyone does something doesn't make it safe or wise. The Victorians eventually learned this lesson, though it took generations and cost countless lives. We have the advantage of their experience if we choose to learn from it. One final parallel deserves mention. The Victorian medical establishment, overwhelmingly male, prescribed laudanum freely to women for women's troubles that were often really symptoms of oppression and restricted lives. Modern medicine has improved, but women still report that their pain is taken less seriously than men's, that they're more likely to be prescribed psychiatric medications for physical complaints, that their symptoms are sometimes dismissed as emotional or hysterical. The specific drugs have changed, the underlying dynamic, a medical system that doesn't always listen to women or take their suffering seriously, that sometimes prefers to medicate rather than investigate, hasn't entirely gone away. The fight for better, more equitable health care continues. The story of laudanum is not just history. It's a mirror reflecting patterns we're still caught in, mistakes we're still making, lessons we're still struggling to learn. And so we return to where we began, a Victorian street